innovation and culture. We bring those two ideas together today with a great guest. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'm happy to have with me as our guest today, all the way from Redwood City, California, Karen Jaw-Madson. I'm going to introduce you to her, and then we're going to dive in. How does that sound? Karen is an organizational expert, and she's enjoyed success as a corporate executive before starting her portfolio career comprised of research, writing, consulting, teaching and speaking, and other creative pursuits. As a versatile leader across multiple industries, Karen developed, led, and implemented numerous organizational initiatives around the globe. Today, this East Coast transplant does live in Redwood City, California. She's also lived in Ireland and the Midwest. She's the principal of the company Design of Work Experience, where she enables organizations with innovative approaches and customized solutions for intimidating challenges. We're going to talk about that today. Her focus areas include culture, organizational change, and people strategies. She has a BA in Ethnic and Cultural Studies from Bryn Mawr College and an MA in Social Organizational Psychology from Columbia. I can't even say all that, and she studied it. So she's also, as are some of our authors here, everybody, she's shy, apparently, because in her bio, she doesn't mention her new book. Her new book is titled Culture Your Culture: Innovating Experiences at Work. If you're watching, you can see it. And if you're not watching, you might want to try that sometime. Karen, welcome. I'm glad to have you here.
Hi, it's great to be here.
I'm glad to have you. So the bio that I just read gave us a little bit about your journey, but I'm just curious if you can tell us a little bit more. You said, I don't know if Kevin, if I'm ever going to write another book, because this one took me a long time.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit about the path that takes you around the world and takes you to this place of being on this podcast with me today.
Oh, well, I grew up in New Jersey, moved around a lot within that state before I went to school around Philadelphia, graduated from college, moved out to California for the first time, and then moved back out east for graduate school. And then from there, that's when I embarked on an expat assignment out to Ireland, which was a great couple of years of experience for us personally and professionally. And then from there, moved to the Midwest, which was a whole new cultural experience in and of itself. And
be careful, I live in Indianapolis, so don't say anything bad about the Midwest.
Not at all. I spent 5 years there, so I've got a lot of great friends that still live out in Wisconsin. So I have a lot of love for all the places I've lived, and counted, I think, or 15 places I've lived, and moved with my spouse nine times. But we've traveled a lot, lots of countries on our path.
Lots of journey that takes you here. And as I said in the bio, you've done a lot of different kinds of things. And I think that has an impact on I want to talk about the book. I want to talk about the design of this book, because the design is innovative. And I'm not necessarily talking about how the words are laid out on the page, but the way the book is designed is interesting. And I'd like you to start there, because in many ways, our whole conversation today is about design, although not book design. So, I mean, here's the thing. You want people to buy this book. So just talk not so much about what it is, but how it is that you came to sort of create it in the way that you did. Can you do that?
Yeah, sure. Well, every book needs its readers, doesn't it? You're an author yourself.
Yep.
So part of the pitch I gave to the publishers I worked with was, this is not your typical business book. I said that up front. And that's really what I intended to do. It's very similar to how I speak in meetings. I don't really say anything unless I have something I feel of value to contribute. And that's really where this book is born out of. Is born out of this frustration with how often we raise culture as this huge factor in the success or failure of companies after the fact. And yet there was no step-by-step how to, for intentionally creating culture on the front end, right? So what I've tried to do with this book is to fill an unmet need out there where there really wasn't this step-by-step, this framework that would help people, guide them through the creation and implementation and sustainability of a culture that's custom designed for their context. So the structure of the book is alongside that. I mean, I didn't want to stick with the traditional outlines that you see typical in many books, although it's still a book. You got to put it on pages here.
It's on pages and it's between covers and all that stuff. But
That's
the
right.
point is there's not case studies in sort of the typical sort of way. There's not quotes from famous people like you often see in books, right? Lots of quotes.
Right.
But so talk about that. That I thought was very interesting to me. Very intentional about how you do quote a lot of people, but talk about why we don't necessarily see Ben Franklin or Peter Drucker or Kevin Eikenberry quoted in the book. But by the way, why not?
Yeah, I know. Well, I'll look into that for the next.
I'm just teasing, but you talk about it was intentional. So talk about that for a second.
It was very intentional. So the absence of case studies is because there's plenty out there. We have lots of data about what works and doesn't work in terms of culture. There's a lot of books around how I did it or what we did, or this is the kind of thing we did. But what we lacked collectively was this whole, how do we create something that's specific to us? Putting case studies in there is really it. I took them out to resist the temptation for organizations to try to copy what other people have done.
Hey, that sounds really good. Let's use that stuff, right? And I think
exactly, it's a shortcut when the people do that.
So that gets at your approach. You come at culture development differently, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to open by talking about the book in that regard. And we are talking about the book, Karen Jaw-Madson's book, Culture, Your Culture. You come at it different. You come at this process of helping an organization think about intentionally develop a culture.
Yeah.
So you do it differently than anyone else I've seen. So talk about your approach a little bit.
Yeah. So the approach is concept, framework, methodology, all in one, and it's called Design of Work Experience. And it's the combination of design and change processes enabled by capability engagement throughout. So those are the four main components, and that's what it looks like at the highest altitude. These are arranged as a series of 5 phases. So those phases are understand, create and learn, implement, decide. Wait, I mixed it all up. Understand, create and learn, decide, plan, and implement. That always happens when you run a list through your head, doesn't it?
It does. I sometimes end up adding something to the list that wasn't even there.
That wasn't there.
To start with, because I'm a person, Karen, I'm a person that thinks out loud. So I'll say, ask me a question. Say, there's 3 things I want to say. And before I'm done, I've got like 5. So
or you do 2 and you're like, what was I going to say?
Exactly.
So that all happens. Yeah. But those 5 phases are there. And just to finish that up, each have progressive learning loops with specific activities. And those are intended to help an organization design, implement, and sustain culture.
Yeah. So you walk through in the book, you walk through a lot of these exercises and how to facilitate them, how to run them, and what the purpose of them are, which is really excellent. But I'd really like you to step back because you said always, when you're the expert, things just like flow out like, oh, of course. But I want you
to as many drafts of this book as I have, of course.
I want you to step back and talk about those 4 components.
Yeah.
Again, and lay those out just a little bit more for people, if you would.
So at the highest altitude, there's this design process, right? So people who come from design or understand design thinking know that, there's typical aspects of how people design, and there's different names people call it, and I call it the names that I call it, but it's really all the similar meaning, right? So there's this whole aspect of being able to understand the context, so I call it people in context, building criteria, insights and criteria out of it, designing it.
Well, let's stop right there, if I can, just for a second.
Sure.
Because to me, that's one of the things that I found really fascinating is, You're not like saying, well, here's the culture you ought to have. You want to have an
No,
engaged employee. Here's the culture you ought to have. You're not coming at it that way.
no. There's lots of stuff
It's
out there
all
with that.
about context, right?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
so you're saying if we want to build a culture in our organization, you're going to come alongside us and help us do that. But if we want to do that, we got to start by really understanding where we are, what our context is, and all that.
Yes.
That's really the understand step.
Yeah. And it's not just in this part of the process, it's the entire process. The reason why there are learning loops, the reason why there are specific activities set in each space has to do with creating culture mindfully. So it's a form of building organizational self-awareness that hopefully through this work is unprecedented up to this point.
Well, I would say that if people are going to follow will follow the process that you've described in the book, that there's no doubt they're going to be a far more self-aware organization than they could have possibly been otherwise.
Right.
I don't
So
think
this,
there's any question about that. So understand is
good.
one step. Understand is one step. What else?
So create and learn is that second phase. And that's really where the fun starts around, it's all fun, of course, but the fun starts around creating something new, innovating, building off of that deep understanding of your own context and being able to solve for challenges or setting conditions where those challenges won't exist. So that's really where we kind of diverge in the process and open things up to integrating. Yeah. So it's that's the way design works. You kind of diverge and converge intentionally to be able to leverage the best of all those phases. And so that's what happens next in that phase is where you bring in all the learnings, you involve the organization because this is a co-design model. So you involve other people.
Wait a minute. Wait. You're not just working with the leadership team and saying, this shall be our culture. I'm sorry. No, I mean, I'm sorry that I didn't actually have you make that comment earlier.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm being silly now, but the point,
Sure.
you really are advocating for us. We sort of said it earlier, but I want to make sure that we're talking about a model where you're bringing the organization together, not the leadership team. We're not going on some retreat.
Right.
With a select group of people.
No, it's an organizational journey. Absolutely.
Organizational process, co-creation. Yeah. So again, sorry to be a little bit.
No, absolutely. And I'm glad we made the point. Sometimes I forget. Again, I've seen this so much now, so second nature to me. But this whole co-creation process brings together, first of all, the talent that is untapped in an organization. It pulls in as much potential as possible and also makes connections that otherwise wouldn't connect. And it brings the organization closer together. Now, usually when there are big edicts, I call them, right? They come from the top and they get pushed down, sometimes not very well, right?
Most times, not
most. Right. Okay, great. I agree with you on that too. I'm trying to be diplomatic. There are good examples out there. But what happens then is the people that are expected to implement or to adopt what's coming down the pike aren't even a part of the process. And does that make sense is the question. And how are you empowering them to be able to implement if they don't understand where it comes from or they didn't have any say in it?
Yeah, like we work hard to hire smart people and then we leave them in the dark
and we ignore them.
Why they ask questions. And so
exactly.
Really? Yeah. And sometimes leaders say, well, that's a problem. Like, well, no, that's not the problem. The problem is you didn't engage people at the front end. There's no sense of ownership.
Right.
You didn't give them any.
Right.
And so,
that's why engagement is throughout this whole entire process and capability as well. You're leveraging and building capability at the same time. That's where all that plays in.
Perfect. So we've talked about understanding, we've talked about creating and learning, right? And so what else are we going to do if we're going to design our work experience?
So the next phase is decide. And that's when the process converges a bit. And the way we decide now, we tend to do a lot of snap judgments, right? Or if we do database decision making, we take the people aspect out of it. But what we do in Dewey when it comes to decide is we iterate our way toward those decisions. And that begins with prototyping. So through the create and learn process where you explored ideas, brainstormed them and played with them, prototype allows you to see how those solutions might work in real life and give you the chance to tinker with them. So instead of one large decision, it's a lot of smaller decisions along the way. That's A, less risky, and B, a little bit more fun, if you ask me. But that helps us make those decisions in a way that's less about the loudest voice in the room or the most popular choice, because we tend as groups to normalize what is most innovative. But it allows us to tinker with the ideas and then be able to select, which is the next learning loop, and decide based upon select criteria that came out of the work that we did earlier in the process. So it's, again, less about popularity, less about the loudest voice in the room, and more around, okay, what is the criteria? What are the need to haves for whatever solution we end up deciding on, or the strategy, and what best meets those needs?
So I just make an observation. I was with a group earlier this week, a leadership team, and the context was quite different, but we were using a process that involved them identifying some criteria and then using those criteria. And we can sit here and nod, and everyone listening can say, man, that makes a lot of sense. And yet it's hard work, right?
Yes,
to get people to get out of their past beliefs, to get out of their silo, to do all that stuff. If we really can identify criteria, and now I'm going wider and broader than just to a principle, more than, Karen, to what you're saying here specifically, we can discipline ourselves to do that. It can be extremely powerful in all sorts of ways.
Oh, totally. I mean, I can tell you that from my experiences, for sure. But I think what it requires us to do is to release or call out, if anything, our biases and assumptions.
Yeah, and it actually pulls them out in a relatively safe-ish way,
yes,
right?
Early
Because now we're talking about what does success looks like. Well, it's this, and this. These are the 4 or 5 criteria, and so we pull that out in a more natural way, and it takes it done well. It can depersonalize it, people.
It does, and the criteria here in when it comes to design of work experience comes from user research, so it's data based. It's not, again, pulled something out of nowhere or our own biases and assumptions. It's based on what we understand in that in-depth study of our current context.
Yep.
So that's part of the process. So that's how decisions get made. And so by the time you get to it, and that's like, I think something like 7 or 8 loops into the process, so much has been done. And that, again, this whole mindfulness is about paying attention of what's in front of you, knowing that the decision is there later on. I think forces people to really be mindful about how they get there in ways that you don't typically, right? We tend to say problem solution, right? We skip everything else in between. And that's all designed into this process intentionally.
Yeah, and so you've created a process that includes all that, which is really great. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we had a guest who agreed with you about the next point that I want to make, because you say we should be wary, I think is a fair word, of best practices. And a couple of weeks ago, we had Jeff Tuff on, and he wrote a book called Detonate Your Business, and he talked about the same thing. So I'm going to have you talk about best practices, but first, for all of you listening, if you didn't hear the episode with Jeff, you want to go back and find it and listen to that. And then see, one of the beautiful things about a podcast like this is you can start to take the ideas you hear from one smart person and hook it together with the ideas from another. So anyway, I'm just saying that we had this conversation a couple of weeks ago with Jeff, and I want you to talk about, again, being wary. Best practices. Well, why?
Yeah, I call that the best practice myth. And that has to do with the fact that we have this assumption, let's say, that just because it's a best practice means it's going to work and it's going to function the way we think it's going to everywhere else. And it's going to apply the same way in my company too, right? And the skill is not necessarily in picking which best practice. It might be the best combination of best practices, right? But oftentimes we want to look for the fastest solution. And that, again, that whole thing around case studies, right? Those are considered best practices sometimes, right? Well, they did it, so it should work for us. And there's no understanding of the complexities behind our own context. I mean, every organization has its own unique context made up of its own people, its own business challenges, its own competitive environment, its own other factors, and its current culture for sure, right?
Right. For sure.
Yeah. So, and that culture, the starting point of that culture culture is always there, right? So it's got the power to affect our behavior, our perceptions, our interactions, right? And so that influence there has to be done intentionally by the time you're done with this process. But in the beginning, it may be just there, right? And people don't realize it. And that has an influence on how best practices get implemented. So that's why I raised that as a concern very early on, because if they're looking for that in my book, it's not going to be there. There's plenty of other books that have that. There are aspects of best practices that are integrated into this process, that curation I talk about.
Right. Right.
But it's not intended, and this whole framework is intended to allow people to customize it to their own context, not copy somebody else.
So you use a 4-letter word in your book.
Oh,
It's one of my favorite well, there's probably a lot of 4-letter words in your book,
but
you actually feel very positive about this particular 4-letter word. It's one of my favorites as well. And it might not be one that people are thinking of as they've been listening to us for 20 minutes. And that word is play.
Mm-hmm.
Play. So let's talk about why play is such an important part of your process, and something as important as the kind of work we're talking about, your change management, cultural change. Why play?
So when it comes to design of works experience, play is a form of learning. And I've got a 9-month-old infant at home, and to see him develop through play is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And it's something that I think that's kind of being bred out of us as we grow up, and we lose the benefits of that, right? So play in the context of design of work experiences around taking ideas and tinkering with them, right? And being able to get to know things by working with them, playing with them. There's an aspect of whimsy in that as well, right? Mm-hmm. And that's usually full of possibilities, openness, right? That's the connotation behind play. And so it's not meant to be this soft thing. Play is actually quite powerful, and you see that in the way children develop for sure. And it's something that we've stopped doing, and we lose the benefit of it. And so putting it back into the process here is to be able to force ourselves to use an old skill, quite frankly, that has gone untapped for so long. And that helps organizations, when you bring together a bunch of people and they play with ideas, just think about the possibilities, the connections that get made, because all those brains are in the same room. It's pretty amazing to watch.
There you go. So there's a conundrum that lots of people talk about that you, I think, have a take on that I'd like to hear about. And I'll frame the conundrum as customers or employees. In other words, most organizations spend a lot of time, effort, money, resources to really understand their customers, often far more so than they understand their employees. Is that the right approach?
I think it's not an either or thing, it's an and, right? So that means, yes, customers are absolutely important, and so are our employees. And I quote somebody in the book around, you satisfy your employees first, and then the customer's satisfaction follows afterwards. And that's not the exact words, but that's the essence of
the idea. Yep.
Yeah, that's the idea. And if you look at customer service, there are absolutely lots of similarities between customer satisfaction and employee satisfaction, is there not? So feedback, satisfaction, measurement of those, personalization versus automation, all those aspects come into the employee space, as they do for, customers and consumers, right? And they care about similar things, reputation, loyalty, right? Brand, business. So there's a lot of similarities in the concepts. And what I argue is you take these lens, it's not like you don't know how to do it. You're constantly looking and understanding your employees. Turn that lens inward and learn something about yourselves and how you can better serve those customers. And by the way, I think the companies that see their customers as part of their own organization, or at the very least part of their ecosystem, I think they're onto something here, because they're looking at things more holistically and understanding the connections between the work that's being done internal and the outcomes they're looking for externally. So sometimes those relationships between customers and employees are the same. And are we not, as employees, also consumers and customers ourselves in some form, shape, or form somewhere else?
Yeah, and certainly if we think about the idea of the internal versus the external customer, we have the same sort of thing going on as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think to ignore that is a bit myopic.
So Karen, I know that you have done your homework and you have listened to the show. So you know what's coming next. The next section of our show is called The Fast Break. It is sponsored by our new book, The Long Distance Leader. You can learn more by going about leading remotely and doing it successfully by going to longdistanceleaderbook.com. Now, we are at the fast break. And for any of you listening who don't know, Karen is prepared. She begged
I don't know what the words are.
She begged me, everybody, before I hit record to give her the words. But I said, no, I would not give her the words. But anyway, for those of you that don't know, I have 3 ideas that I'm going to share with her. She doesn't know what they are. I just want her to give us her thoughts about them. Smart people talking about interesting things. And here they are. The first one is accountability.
Accountability. I think I'm in the Brene Brown school of thought around that. It's not about blame. It is about commitments. Do you want longer answers or shorter?
No, that's a perfectly fine answer. There's no wrong. The beautiful thing about these,
no right or wrong.
There's no wrong answers, right? Yeah. I could comment. We could have probably a whole show on that last statement.
Oh gosh,
Go on.
No, it is about commitment, though. I think at the end of the day.
Right. Okay. Second is leadership development.
Leadership development. I think it's a misconception to think that's only for an exclusive group of people. I think that's something that should be democratized a little bit more than it is today.
Okay. As a person who delivers such services, all of you listening, I would agree. Okay. And the third one.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll send you the check on that one, Karen. The third one is innovation.
Innovation. Oh gosh. All right. So when people talk about innovation, they think, oh, it's this wild and crazy thing. And it's actually something that taps into something very close to us. To be innovative means it needs to connect in reality as well, right? So that's the difference between creativity and innovation. So I think when something is innovative or you're innovating something, it taps into something that's very core to us, and it's meeting an unmet need that sometimes we didn't know we had, right? So that's innovation to me. There's an aspect of playing out in reality.
It
makes sense.
It's not just the idea; it's some action is taken, right? You talked earlier about the idea of I'm not gonna have the right word, but trying things incrementally, trying a small,
iteratively, yeah.
Iteratively, and so this is very much a part of that, right?
Absolutely. I'm consistent, if not anything else.
It's awesome. It's just fantastic. So Karen, we know something about what you probably do for fun when you're not working and writing and such, because you have a 9-month-old. But like, what is it that you do for fun?
Well, I do a lot of things in this last bucket of my portfolio career, and that is creative pursuits. And that's what I called it. So a little bit of art, and I have a wonderful circle of friends that we support each other in that. We have our day jobs, and we sometimes monetize the work that we do. We have open studios, and it's a way of sharing our work with other people. But I do a lot of artwork. Not as much as I'd like to these days, because as you know, I have an infant.
Because you have a 9-month-old. Everyone who's listening understands.
But I am getting a crash course in play again, so that's pretty amazing for me. But yeah, I do a lot of art. I tend to like a lot of cultural things, right? So that's a common theme in my life, as you know. And so any aspect of events that look at things a little bit differently, or where I'm going to have some sort of profound learning, I really look for opportunities to do that.
Excellent. Thank you. So I know that another thing that you do is read. And I ask everybody that I have here. And for all of you listening, I don't just ask the people on this show this question, but I ask smart people in my life this question. And so I encourage you to do the same. But you get to get through me to hear all this from these other smart people like Karen. So what do you read? What are you reading? What have you read recently, perhaps?
I tend to stay in the nonfiction space with the occasional fiction book here and there. But what I have right now on my bookshelf that I'm trying to get through is So You Want to Talk About Race. And as a person of color, this book is really important to me. I've done a lot of reading around ethnic and cultural identities in my lifetime. What this, first of all, this is contemporary, which is great. It gives somebody like me who's a person of color the language and the discussion points to make that I never had the words to be able to say so eloquently. So I really appreciate the author for that.
All right.
And for others, I think it's an opportunity for them to build some empathy and a greater understanding of the systems behind what we call this social construct called race. So I'm a big systems thinker person. You see that in my writing as well.
For sure. Yep.
The other thing we have in common is this values-based leadership. That also shows up in this work. But the So You Want to Talk About Race, I think, is really important, particularly in our current context as a society today and the discussions that we're having.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. And again, every week we're trying to do that with smart people like you. And so I appreciate that. So now I'll ask you the question you've been most wanting me to ask from the very beginning, Karen, which is, where can people learn more about you and your work and get a hold of the book, et cetera?
Yeah, the book is available, as most books are, on Amazon, but it is also available through, thank you. It is
if
available.
you're watching, I'm showing it to you.
Yeah, he's showing it. Yeah, and I'm very proud of the cover that my publisher collaborated with me on, and I'm very happy with the outcome. It's available on Amazon and through my publisher, Emerald Publishing Group, and those are probably the easiest ways to get to them. I am online everywhere: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, of course. So it's really easy to get in contact with me. I really appreciate the interaction and the engagement from people. To me, this is my contribution. We're going to work together. We're going to build this collective knowledge, and we're going to advance beyond where we are today. And I love that aspect of the work that we do. And I'm sure you see this in practice as well, is that you get as much out of it as and you come in and you're helping an organization, and you get a lot out of it too, right? So it's,
listen, I'm the luckiest person on the planet. I get to learn. I get paid every day to learn.
That's
awesome.
right. Yeah. So there's this whole thing that we've been talking about, this whole theme around designing things. This is about our aspirations, but the thing that follows is, of course, change, right? And that's really the name of the game, is can we make it a reality, right? And you can have a great design, and if you can't implement it, it's not going to be as powerful. And if you implement something that's not well designed, it's also not going to be good. So it's all the name of the game that we do here together.
Speaking of learning and taking action, it leads me to the only question I have for all of you listening, which is, now what? What are you going to do as a result of this? It's one thing to intellectually take in what we said and to take notes. I hope maybe you've done that at a few places along the way. But what I want you to do now is to go back and say, okay, what am I going to do? What action am I going to take? What insight did I get that I can do something with, other than, of course, buying a copy of Your Culture, Innovating Experiences at Work.
Yeah, there's a call to action there. Yeah.
The question is, now what? So please do think about that, everybody. Yes. And please do join us again next week. But before that, let me just say again, Karen, Jaw-Madson, thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation.
All right. And again, we're here every week with more great conversations. So everybody, why don't you join us next week again for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast? Thanks, everybody.